The first stone struck Mara Walsh's shoulder as she knelt beside her son's fresh grave, her bloodied hands still clutching the makeshift wooden cross she had carved from her husband's rifle stock. The second stone shattered against the headstone, spraying fragments across the small mound of Kansas dirt that covered 7-year-old Tommy's fever-ravaged body. "Witch!" Someone screamed from the crowd gathering in the twilight. "Child killer." Mara didn't look up. Her fingers found the crumpled letter in her apron pocket, and the letter that had arrived 3 days after Tommy's death, bearing Morrison Mining Consortium's letterhead and a single chilling line: "Your husband's investigation dies with him. Make no mistake about your own fate." The crowd pressed closer, their faces twisted with grief and superstition. These people had once called her friend, had brought their children to her. For healing had shared her table and her laughter. Now they stood like vultures, feeding on her anguish. She cursed the whole town. Sheriff Grant Morrow's voice cut through the evening air. "First her husband dies, hunting outlaws. Then her boy burns with fever. Now half our children are sick. Enough is enough." That's when the stranger stepped from the shadows. Jonas Vane moved like smoke, given form, his scarred hands resting easy on his gun belt, his pale eyes scanning the mob with professional assessment. Without a word, he positioned himself between Mara and the crowd, his presence radiating the quiet menace of a man who had killed before and would kill again. "That's far enough," he said quietly. The mob hesitated. They had heard whispers about the gunfighter who had drifted into Red Hollow 3 weeks ago, a man with dead eyes and lightning hands, a killer without conscience or mercy. Preacher Jonathan Finch pushed through the crowd, his Bible clutched like a weapon. "Stand aside, stranger. God's judgment cannot be denied." Jonas smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "God can wait his turn. Right now you're dealing with me." In the gathering darkness, with her son's grave at her back and 100 hostile faces before her, Mara felt the weight of Morrison's threat, pressing down like a tombstone. They had killed Sam for discovering their crimes. Now they meant to destroy her for the sin of surviving him. But as she watched the scarred gunfighter face down an entire town for a woman he barely knew, Mara Walsh made a decision that would either save Red Hollow or see it burn to ash and memory. She would not go quietly into the grave they had dug for her. 8 months had passed since the Broken Creek gang rode through Red Hollow like the wrath of God, leaving 6 men dead and a town forever changed. Dr. Samuel Walsh had been among those who fell gunned down while trying to protect his neighbors from the raiders who seemed to know exactly where to strike and when. The official story was simple outlaws had attacked the town, good men had died defending it, and the survivors should count themselves lucky. But Mara had found inconsistencies in that story, too many to ignore, too dangerous to voice aloud. Sam's medical bag had been thoroughly searched, though nothing of obvious value was missing. His notes on water contamination in the northern mining camps had vanished completely. And 3 days before his death, he had confided to Mara his suspicions about Morrison Mining's operations, suspicions that had apparently reached the wrong ears. Now she was paying the price for her husband's integrity. "Widow Walsh," the townspeople whispered when she passed. "Witch woman. Death follows her like a shadow." The transformation had been gradual, but relentless. First, they stopped bringing their children to her for healing. Then they crossed the street to avoid her. Finally, they began to blame her. For every misfortune that befell Red Hollow drought sickness, even the failure of crops in soil that had been productive for generations. Only 2 people in Red Hollow still treated her with kindness. Ruth Hendricks, the town's seamstress, was too old and stubborn to care what people thought. She remembered when Mara had delivered half the babies in town, when her herb garden had provided medicine for rich and poor alike. The other was the stranger Jonas Vane, he had told her when he first appeared at her door with an offer to repair her broken fence. He was a man of few words and many scars, a gunfighter seeking something that might have been redemption or might have been death. "Why?" she had asked him. Why help me when the whole town wants me gone? His answer had been cryptic. I knew your husband, owed him a debt. But Sam had never mentioned knowing any gunfighters, and Jonas offered no further explanation. He simply appeared when she needed help, most fixing her roof, when vandals damaged it standing guard, when the harassment grew too bold, bringing her supplies, when the merchants refused to serve her. Mara's salvation and her prison was the herb garden behind her cabin. Here, among the medicinal plants she had cultivated for 8 years, she found both purpose and persecution. The townspeople might shun her by day, but at night, desperate mothers still crept to her door with fevered children and whispered pleas for help. Please. Sarah Hoffman had begged just 2 nights ago, her infant daughter burning with fever. I know what people say about you, but she's dying, and Dr. Kemp says there's nothing more he can do. Mara had saved the child, as she had saved so many others. But each healing only fed the town's suspicions, each cure became evidence of her supposed dark powers. The worst of it was the knowledge that Sam had died trying to protect these same people from Morrison's crimes. His research into contaminated water supplies could have saved hundreds of lives, prevented countless cases of the mysterious fevers that plagued the territory's mining camps. Instead, it had gotten him killed and marked her for destruction. The persecution reached a new level when Preacher Finch began dedicating his sermons to the dangers of harboring ungodly influences. Sheriff Morrow, who had once been Sam's friend, now watched her with cold suspicion and barely concealed hostility. Mark my words, Finch thundered from his pulpit. The devil walks among us in woman's form, bringing pestilence and death to the innocent. Only through righteous action can we cleanse our community of this corruption. The congregation hung on every word, their fear and grief transformed into righteous anger with a convenient target. They needed someone to blame for their losses, someone to punish for their pain. Mara Walsh, the doctor's widow, who knew too much and had nowhere to run, was perfect for the role. But she was not as defenseless as they believed. In her late husband's desk, hidden beneath false bottoms and secret compartments, she had found his real research-detailed documentation of Morrison's crimes, chemical analyses of contaminated water maps, showing the extent of the environmental poisoning. Sam had been building a case that could have brought down one of the territory's most powerful men. Now it was up to his widow to finish what he had started, if she could stay alive long enough to see justice done. The confrontation at Tommy's grave had been inevitable. Mara had felt it building for weeks, saw it in the increasingly hostile stares, heard it in the whispered conversations that stopped whenever she appeared. Now the time for hiding was over. The people of Red Hollow wanted a witch to burn. Instead, they were about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous person in a room was the one with nothing left to lose. The mob dispersed slowly, grudgingly driven back by Jonas Vane's casual threat of violence, and the uncomfortable reality that most of them were unarmed farmers facing a professional killer, but their anger remained festering like an infected wound. Mara finished her vigil at Tommy's grave as Jonas stood guard in the gathering darkness. When she finally rose, her knees stiff from kneeling on the hard ground, she found herself face to face with the man who had saved her from the crowd's violence. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet, this isn't over." He was right. The crowd had retreated, but they hadn't given up. Through the darkness, she could see lights flickering in windows. Throughout Red Hollow could hear the low murmur of voices planning and plotting. "They'll be back," Jonas continued. "Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll be back. And next time they'll come prepared. What do you suggest I do, run? That would be the smart thing." He studied her face in the starlight, seeing something there that made him nod slowly. "But you're not going to run, are you? This is my home. My husband is buried here, my son. I won't let them drive me away from everything I have left. Then we'd better figure out why they want you gone so badly. This isn't just about grief and superstition. Someone's stirring this pot, feeding the flames. Mara thought of Morrison's letter still crumpled in her pocket. Someone is, but proving it won't be easy, or proving it might not be necessary. Sometimes the truth has a way of coming out on its own, especially when powerful men get careless. The next morning brought validation of Jonas's predictions. Mara woke to find a notice nailed to her door, an official document bearing Sheriff Morrow's seal and the territorial government's authority. By order of the Territorial Health Commission, it read, Mrs. Mara Walsh is hereby forbidden from practicing any form of medicine or healing within the boundaries of Red Hollow Territory of Kansas. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and prosecution for endangering public health. The notice was signed by Dr. Marcus Kemp, the town's official physician, and countersigned by Sheriff Morrow. At the bottom, in smaller print, was a line that made Mara's blood run cold. This order issued at the request of Morrison Mining Consortium, acting in the public interest. Morrison wasn't even pretending to hide his involvement anymore. The mining magnate was systematically destroying her life, with the casual efficiency of a man swatting flies. Jonas appeared at her door as she was reading the notice for the third time, trying to find some legal loophole or administrative error that might invalidate it. "What's that?" She handed him the document. His expression darkened as he read. "Morrison Mining," he said quietly. "That's interesting. You know them." "I know enough. Charles Morrison owns half the mining operations in the territory, plus railroad interests, cattle ranches, and politicians by the dozen. If he wants you silenced, he's got the power to make it happen. But why I'm nobody, just a doctor's widow trying to survive?" Jonas was quiet for a long moment, his scarred face thoughtful. Maybe that's exactly why. Maybe being nobody makes you dangerous to somebody. Before Mara could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Sheriff Morrow rode up with 2 deputies, their faces set with official purpose. "Mrs. Walsh," Morrow announced, dismounting with deliberate ceremony. "I trust you've seen the notice." "I've seen it. I've also seen its sponsor. Morrison Mining has a legitimate interest in public health. The company employs half the men in this territory, and they can't afford to have their workers exposed to questionable medical practices." Questionable. Mara's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "I've been healing people in this town for 8 years. I've delivered babies, treated fevers, set bones. And how many of those patients died?" Morrow interrupted. "How many children caught fever after visiting your cabin? How many perfectly healthy people developed mysterious ailments after accepting your medicine?" The accusations were lies, but they were clever lies, the kind that were impossible to disprove because they relied on fear rather than facts. "Sheriff," Jonas interjected quietly, "you might want to be careful about the accusations you make. Mrs. Walsh has friends who take a dim view of false charges." Morrow's hand moved toward his gun. "Are you threatening a lawman, stranger?" "I'm giving friendly advice, free of charge." The tension stretched between them like a taut wire. Then one of the deputies whispered something in Morrow's ear, and the sheriff's expression shifted slightly. "Right now, we're just serving papers," Morrow said finally. "But if Mrs. Walsh violates this order, if she so much as gives someone a cup of willow bark tea, she'll be arrested. And anyone who assists her will be charged as an accessory." As the lawmen rode away, Mara felt the walls closing in around her. Morrison's conspiracy was more sophisticated than she had imagined, using legal mechanisms to destroy her while maintaining a facade of official legitimacy. "There's something else," she told Jonas when they were alone. "Something I haven't told you." She retrieved Sam's hidden research from its secret compartment, spreading the documents across her kitchen table. Jonas studied them with growing amazement. Water contamination reports, chemical analyses, maps showing pollution patterns. He looked up at her with new respect. "Your husband was building a case against Morrison Mining." He discovered that Morrison's operations were poisoning water supplies throughout the territory. The mysterious fevers that have been killing children, they're not natural diseases. They're caused by toxic runoff from the mining camps. And now Morrison's trying to frame you as the source of the contamination. It's more than that. By discrediting me as a healer, he's ensuring that no one will listen if I try to expose his crimes. Who would believe a witch accused of practicing dark medicine? Jonas was quiet for a long time, studying the documents with the intensity of a man solving a puzzle. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Mara look up sharply. There's something I need to tell you. About why I came to Red Hollow about the debt I owed your husband. But before he could continue, the sound of breaking glass interrupted them. Through the window, they could see smoke rising from her herb garden. Someone had set fire to her medicinal plants while they were inside talking. My garden. Mara rushed outside to find her life's work going up in flames. 8 years of careful cultivation, rare plants gathered from across the territory, medicines that could save lives, all of it reduced to smoke and ash. Standing at the edge of the firelight, watching the destruction with satisfied smiles, were Billy Hoffman and 3 other young men from town. They scattered when they saw Jonas emerge from the cabin, but not before he got a good look at their faces. Sons of bitches, he muttered, drawing his gun. No. Mara grabbed his arm. Killing them won't bring back my garden. It will only give Morrow an excuse to arrest us both. She was right, but the loss was devastating. Without her herbs, she couldn't help the sick children who still came to her door in secret. Without her healing work, she had no purpose left in Red Hollow, except as a target for the town's fear and Morrison's greed. But as she watched her garden burn, Mara felt something else kindling inside her, not despair, but anger. Cold, calculating fury at the men who had destroyed her family, and now sought to erase every trace of her existence. You were going to tell me something, she said to Jonas as the last of the flames died down. About my husband. Yes. His voice was heavy with reluctance. But not here, not tonight. There are things you need to know, but first, we need to make sure you live long enough to hear them. In the distance, church bells began to toll, not the measured rhythm of calling people to worship, but the rapid, urgent clanging that meant fire or disaster. Through the smoke and darkness, they could see people running in the streets. What now, Mara wondered. Their answer came in the form of frantic pounding on her door. Hattie Morrison stood on her threshold, her 4-year-old daughter Claire limp in her arms. Please. The young mother gasped. The fever's back, and it's worse than before. 3 children are already dead, and more are dying. You're the only one who can help. I can't, Mara said desperately. I'm forbidden to practice medicine. If they catch me, if you don't try, my daughter dies. Hattie's voice cracked with desperation. I don't care what they call you. I don't care about their laws. Please. Looking at the dying child, Mara made the decision that would either damn her or set her free. She opened her door wide. Bring her inside. Behind Hattie, other mothers emerged from the darkness, carrying their own fevered children. Despite the legal prohibition, despite the town's hostility, despite the risk of arrest and worse, they had come to the one person who might save their babies. As Mara worked by candlelight to treat the sick children with what few medicines she had left, she realized that Morrison's conspiracy had overreached itself. By making her practice illegal, they had only made it more desperately necessary. The real battle for Red Hollow was about to begin. Dawn brought Sheriff Morrow and a dozen men to Mara's door, their faces set with righteous purpose and official authority. Through her windows, she could see mothers fleeing with their children, scattering like frightened birds before the approaching storm. Mrs. Walsh. Morrow's voice cracked like a whip in the morning air. Come out with your hands visible. You're under arrest for violating territorial health ordinances. Stay calm, Jonas murmured from beside her window, his hands steady on his weapons. Let them make the first move. Mara opened her door, slowly stepping into the harsh sunlight, with her chin raised defiantly. Behind Mara stood men she had known for years, neighbors, friends of her late husband, fathers of children she had delivered into the world. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "3 children died last night while you were planning my arrest. How many more will die while I sit in your jail? That's not your concern anymore." Morrow held up a pair of iron shackles. "You've been forbidden to practice medicine in this territory. Last night's activities constitute a direct violation of that order. Those activities saved lives. Did they?" Preacher Finch emerged from behind the sheriff, his Bible clutched in hands that trembled with righteous fury. "Mary Patterson's boy took sick right after visiting your cabin. The Henderson girl was perfectly healthy until her mother brought her here for your treatment. How do we know you're not the source of the fever, not its cure?" The accusation was monstrous, but Mara could see its effect on the watching crowd. Fear and grief made people desperate for simple explanations. She was the most convenient target for their anguish. "I've been treating fever victims, not creating them," she said firmly. "If you want to know the real source of the sickness, ask Sheriff Morrow about Morrison Mining's water contamination reports." "Oh, that's enough." Morrow stepped forward, shackles raised. "You're coming with me, witch." "I don't think so." Jonas appeared beside Mara, his coat swept back to reveal the Colt at his hip. The morning sun caught the metal, turning it to deadly fire. "Mrs. Walsh isn't going anywhere." "Stand aside, gunfighter. This is official business." "So is this." Jonas's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had faced death and found it wanting. "Any man who wants to arrest Mrs. Walsh will have to go through me first." The crowd murmured uneasily. They had heard stories about Jonas Vane, whispers about his speed with a gun, rumors about the men he had killed in a dozen frontier towns. Facing an unarmed woman was one thing. Facing a professional killer was quite another. But Billy Hoffman, still smarting from his failure to burn down Mara's garden without consequences, pushed through the crowd with young man's bravado and old man's hatred. "We won't be cowed by one gunslinger," he shouted. "There's a dozen of us, and one of him. 12 to 1. Jonas smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I've faced worse odds." Billy raised his rifle, and Jonas's gun cleared leather faster than thought. The bullet shattered the weapon's stock, sending splinters flying and spinning the young man to the ground with his hands bleeding. "Next man who draws on me won't get a warning shot," Jonas said calmly, holstering his weapon. The demonstration of speed and accuracy had its intended effect. The crowd began to disperse, their courage evaporating in the face of professional violence. But their anger remained, and Mara knew this was only a temporary reprieve. As the last man walked away, Sheriff Morrow turned back to her with cold promise in his eyes. "This isn't over, witch. Mark my words, justice will be done." "Whose justice?" Mara called after him. "Yours or Morrison's?" But Morrow was already riding away, leaving her alone with Jonas and the bitter knowledge that she had become a fugitive in her own home. "They'll be back," Jonas said quietly. "And next time they'll be ready for me." "Then we'd better be ready for them." Mara turned to face him, seeing something in his expression that made her heart skip. "You were going to tell me about my husband, about the debt you owed him." Jonas was quiet for a long moment, his scarred face troubled. "It's not a story I'm proud of." "Tell me anyway." "I met Sam Walsh 3 years ago down in Tombstone. I was dying from a bullet wound, bleeding out in an alley behind a saloon. Your husband found me there, patched me up, never asked questions about how I got shot or why." "That sounds like Sam. He always said healing was about the patient, not the circumstances. He saved my life that night. But there's more." Jonas's voice grew heavier. 6 months ago, I was contacted by agents of Morrison Mining. They offered me money, a lot of money, to gather information about Dr. Samuel Walsh's research into water contamination. The words hit Mara like a physical blow. You worked for Morrison. I was told your husband was a fraud, selling fake certificates to mining companies to hide safety violations. Morrison's people showed me forged documents, false evidence that painted him as corrupt. Jonas couldn't meet her eyes. I believed them because I wanted to believe them. The money they offered was exactly what I needed to buy a small ranch to stop being a gunfighter. So you spied on my husband. I reported on his activities, yes. But I swear to you, I thought I was exposing corruption, not enabling it. The betrayal was staggering. The man who had protected her, who had claimed to honor her husband's memory, was the one who had sold Sam to his killers. When did you realize the truth? When Dr. Walsh was murdered. Morrison's agents killed him the day before he was supposed to testify before federal investigators about water contamination in the mining camps. That's when I knew I hadn't been hired to expose corruption, I had been hired to enable it. Mara stared at him in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of his betrayal. You killed him. You may not have pulled the trigger, but you gave Morrison the information he needed to silence my husband. I know, and I've been trying to make amends ever since. Amends? Her voice rose to a shout. You think protecting me makes up for murdering Sam? You think standing guard at my door erases your role in destroying my family? No, nothing can do that. But maybe it can stop Morrison from destroying anyone else's family. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Through the dust and heat shimmer, they could see riders coming fast, 6 men armed and dangerous, moving with the professional efficiency of hired killers. Oh, bounty hunters, Jonas said grimly. Morrison's cleaning up loose ends. What do? We run or we fight, but we decide now. Looking at the approaching riders, then back at the town that had rejected her, Mara made her choice. We fight, but not here. Where? The old mining station up north. It's defensible and it has a telegraph. If we can get word out about Morrison's crimes, that's 20 miles through hostile territory. Then we'd better start riding. They mounted quickly, taking only what they could carry. Behind them, Red Hollow lay baking in the morning sun, unaware that its fate hung in the balance of a desperate chase across the Kansas wilderness. As they rode north toward an uncertain destiny, Mara felt the weight of her husband's research in her saddlebags, evidence that could bring down Morrison's conspiracy if she lived long enough to present it. The first obstacle had been overcome, but at a cost that left her alliance with Jonas strained and fragile. The man who had betrayed her husband was now her only hope of survival, and that bitter irony would color every mile of the desperate journey ahead. The chase began in earnest as the sun climbed toward its zenith, turning the Kansas landscape into a furnace of dust and mirages. Behind them, Morrison's hired killers maintained a steady pace, professional hunters who knew their prey was wounded and desperate. They're not trying to catch us, Jonas observed, glancing back at their pursuers. They're herding us. Toward what? An ambush, most likely. Morrison's had months to plan this operation. He'll have men waiting at every waterhole, every natural shelter between here and the mining station. The first trap came at Devil's Creek, where the old cattle trail narrowed between towering sandstone cliffs. Jonas spotted the glint of rifle barrels in the rocks above and pulled up sharply. Dismount, he ordered. We go around. But going around meant leaving the trail, venturing into trackless desert, where a wrong turn could mean death by thirst. As they led their horses through the maze of canyons and dry washes, the sun beat down mercilessly, and their water supplies dwindled with each passing hour. Why? Mara asked during a brief rest in the shade of an overhanging rock. Why go to all this trouble to silence one woman Morrison's already discredited me, turned the town against me? Why not just let me disappear into obscurity? Because you have your husband's research, Jonas replied. And because Morrison knows that guilt and anger make people dangerous. He can't risk you finding allies, can't chance you presenting your evidence to the right people. So he plans to kill us both. He plans to make us disappear. When the bounty hunters report back, the story will be that we died in the desert, victim of thirst, heat, and our own desperation. No bodies to examine, no evidence to contradict the official narrative. The second trap waited at Eagle's Roost, a natural formation that provided the only reliable shade for miles around. This time, the ambushers weren't content to wait. They opened fire as soon as Mara and Jonas appeared, forcing them to take cover behind a fallen boulder while bullets chipped stone around their heads. "How many?" Mara asked, pressing herself against the rock as lead whistled overhead. 3, maybe 4. Professional shooters by the sound of their rifles. Jonas returned fire, methodically conserving ammunition while seeking clear targets. But the attackers were well positioned and patient, content to pin them down while the desert heat did its work. "We can't stay here," Mara said. "We'll cook like eggs on a skillet." "I know, but if we run, they'll pick us off in the open." The standoff stretched for an hour, then 2. The sun reached its peak and began its slow descent toward the western horizon. But the heat remained brutal. Mara felt her strength ebbing, her vision blurring from dehydration and exhaustion. That's when salvation came from an unexpected source. A dust devil. One of the spinning columns of wind and debris that danced across the desert landscape swept through the ambush site like the finger of an angry god. The sudden windstorm sent the attackers scrambling for cover, at their careful positions compromised by flying sand and debris. Now, Jonas grabbed Mara's hand, and they ran using the dust devil as cover while they sprinted toward their horses. Shots rang out behind them, but the swirling sand made accurate aim impossible. They mounted and rode hard, putting miles between themselves and the ambush site before the wind died down. But the escape came at a cost. One of their water bottles had been shattered by a stray bullet, and their remaining supplies wouldn't last another day in the brutal heat. "The mining station is still 10 miles away," Jonas said during their next rest stop. "We won't make it without water." And we find water. Mara studied the landscape with the eye of someone who had learned to read the desert's subtle signs. There's see how the vegetation changes along that dry creek bed. There's water underground, maybe only a few feet down. They spent precious time digging in the sandy soil, following the ancient course of a stream that had died decades ago. Just when despair threatened to overwhelm them, Jonas's shovel struck moisture. Another few inches, and clear, sweet water began seeping into their makeshift well. As they refilled their bottles and watered their horses, Mara felt a strange sense of partnership with the man who had betrayed her husband. Survival had a way of forcing people together, creating bonds that transcended past wrongs. "There's something else you need to know," Jonas said as they prepared to continue their journey. "About Morrison's operation, about why he's so desperate to silence you." "What?" "It's bigger than water contamination. Morrison's been running a territory-wide conspiracy for years, bribing officials, eliminating whistleblowers, covering up environmental crimes that have killed hundreds of people." "How do you know this?" "Because I've been gathering evidence ever since I realized what I'd done to your husband." Morrison's crimes go back decades, Mara. He's poisoned entire watersheds, buried safety reports, had inspectors murdered or transferred. Your husband's research was just the latest threat to his operation. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Morrison wasn't just a corrupt businessman, he was the architect of a criminal empire that stretched across multiple territories. "The mining station has more than just a telegraph," Jonas continued. "It has Morrison's private communications, shipping records, financial documents. Everything we need to expose the whole operation. If we can reach it alive. If we can reach it alive." The third trap was the most sophisticated yet. As they approached the final ridge before the mining station, The ground erupted around them. Hidden charges probably planted days in advance turned the narrow trail into a killing field of flying rock and deadly shrapnel. Their horses went down immediately, both animals killed by the explosion. Mara felt something hot and sharp tear across her shoulder, and Jonas grunted as debris opened a gash along his ribs. "Move!" he shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the shelter of an overturned boulder. But this time, their attackers weren't content to wait for the heat to do their work. Professional killers emerged from concealed positions, advancing with military precision while maintaining devastating firepower. "Davis." Jonas breathed, recognizing the lead attacker. Federal Marshal, or at least someone wearing a Marshal star. Marshal Theodore Davis was everything Jonas wasn't: tall, thin, with pale eyes, and a silver badge pinned to his vest. He moved with the cold efficiency of a man who killed for duty rather than survival. "Mrs. Walsh." Davis called out, his voice carrying clearly across the rocky terrain. "I'm here on federal authority to arrest you for conspiracy murder and crimes against the territorial government. Come out with your hands visible, and I'll make this quick." "But what evidence?" Jonas called back from behind their makeshift barricade. "Evidence enough. Poisoned medicines found at multiple death sites, witness statements placing her at the scene of several outbreaks, federal testimony identifying her as the source of the contamination." The lies were so brazen, so perfectly crafted, that Mara almost admired their audacity. Morrison had spent considerable time and money creating this false narrative, coaching witnesses and planting evidence. "I've never been to most of those places," she called out. "I've lived in Red Hollow for 8 years. Check your facts, Marshal." "Facts are what I say they are, Mrs. Walsh. Now come out or we'll drag you out." The assault began with professional coordination, from the attackers moving to flank their position while maintaining suppressing fire. Jonas met them with desperate skill, his guns speaking death and defiance in the thin mountain air. But there were too many of them, and his ammunition was running low. As the circle tightened around their position, Mara began to accept that their desperate gamble had failed. That's when she heard it, and the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats, many horses moving fast toward their position. Through the dust and heat shimmer, she could see riders coming, a full cavalry troop with federal banners flying. "What the hell?" Davis muttered, lowering his rifle slightly. The cavalry arrived like an answer to prayer, led by a genuine federal marshal whose badge carried real authority. Marshal James Crawford was everything Davis pretended to be, a career lawman with steel-gray hair and integrity written in every line of his weathered face. "Stand down!" Crawford's voice cracked like a whip across the battlefield. "This operation is terminated by federal authority, by Marshal Crawford." Davis called out, trying to maintain his composure. "This is my jurisdiction. I'm arresting fugitives wanted for crimes you manufactured." Crawford dismounted, his hand resting on his sidearm. "We've been monitoring Morrison's operation for months, Davis. We know about the forged evidence, the false witnesses, the systematic elimination of inconvenient truth-tellers. The game was up, and Davis knew it. But cornered men were dangerous, especially when they had nothing left to lose. You're too late," he snarled, raising his rifle toward Mara. "The witch dies today, federal authority or no federal authority." The shot that rang out wasn't from Davis's rifle. Jonas, bleeding and exhausted, had found the strength for one last act of redemption. His bullet took Davis center mass, spinning the corrupt lawman around and sending him tumbling down the rocky slope. As federal troops secured the area and arrested Morrison's surviving gunmen, Mara felt the crushing weight of the past months finally beginning to lift. But the cost had been enormous, in lives lost, trust broken, and innocence destroyed. The rising action had reached its peak, setting the stage for the final confrontation that would determine not just her fate, but the future of everyone Morrison's conspiracy had touched. As Marshal Crawford's men secured the crime scene and tended to the wounded, a terrible truth began to emerge from the chaos. Crawford himself delivered the blow that shattered Mara's remaining illusions about the scope of Morrison's conspiracy. "Mrs. Walsh," he said quietly, "there's something you need to know. Your husband's death, it wasn't random outlaw violence. We have evidence that Sheriff Mara was directly involved in planning the attack that killed Dr. Walsh." The revelation hit Mara like a physical blow. Grant Morrow, but he was Sam's friend. They served together in the war, which made him the perfect inside man. Crawford continued grimly. "According to our investigation, Morrow provided the Broken Creek gang with detailed information about your husband's movements, his research schedule, even the location of his private papers. But Jonas, bleeding from his wounds, but still conscious, delivered the devastating final piece of the puzzle. There's more," he said weakly. "Marshall, show her the telegram we found in Davis's saddlebags." Crawford produced a yellowed piece of paper, his expression grave. "This came through 3 days before your husband's murder, Mrs. Walsh. It's addressed to Sheriff Morrow from Morrison Mining." Mara read the telegram with growing horror. "Walsh becoming problem. Stop eliminate before federal testimony. Stop payment on completion. Stop make it look random. Stop. Grant killed my husband." She whispered the words, tasting like poison in her mouth. "Not strangers, not random outlaws. My husband's oldest friend murdered him for money." "It gets worse," Crawford said gently. "We found Morrow's payment records. Morrison paid him $5,000 for arranging Dr. Walsh's death, plus monthly stipends for maintaining the cover-up and persecuting you. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Everyone she had trusted, the law, the church, even her neighbors, had been corrupted by Morrison's money and influence. The entire town had been turned against her through a campaign of lies orchestrated by men she had considered friends. But the worst revelation was yet to come. "Jonas," she said, turning to the wounded gunfighter, "you said you gathered information about Sam for Morrison's people. What exactly did you tell them?" Jonas's face went pale. "His research locations, his contacts in the territorial government, and the timing of his planned testimony." His voice trailed off as the implication hit him. "Oh God. I gave them everything they needed to kill him. You didn't just spy on my husband." Mara said, her voice deadly quiet. "You planned his murder. You gave Morrison's killers the information they needed to hunt him down and execute him. I didn't know. You didn't want to know." The fury that had been building inside her for months finally exploded. "You took their money and asked no questions, because it was easier than facing the truth." The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of gunfire in the distance. Through the dust and smoke, they could see Red Hollow burning on the horizon, not just buildings, but entire blocks consumed by flames that reached toward the darkening sky. "What's happening?" Mara demanded. "The Morrison's cleanup operation," Crawford replied grimly. When word reached him that this operation had failed, he activated his scorched earth protocol. He's destroying all evidence of his crimes, including any witnesses who might testify against him. The people are being evacuated or eliminated depending on what they know. Crawford's voice was heavy with regret. "We got here as fast as we could, but Morrison had contingency plans for every scenario." Through her field glasses, Mara could see the systematic destruction of her hometown. Morrison's mercenaries were moving through Red Hollow like a plague, setting fires and eliminating anyone who might pose a threat to their employer's empire. "Ruth," she whispered, thinking of the brave old seamstress who had stood by her. "Hattie Morrison and the other mothers who brought their children to me. We have to assume they're targets," Crawford said. "Morrison can't afford to leave any witnesses alive." The midpoint twist was complete. Everything Mara had believed about her persecution was revealed to be part of a much larger conspiracy. Morrison hadn't just targeted her. He had systematically corrupted an entire community, turning neighbors against each other while covering up crimes that spanned decades. But perhaps the most devastating revelation was the extent of Jonas's betrayal. The man she had begun to trust, the gunfighter who claimed to be seeking redemption, was directly responsible for her husband's murder. His guilt had driven him to protect her, but it couldn't undo the damage he had already caused. As Red Hollow burned in the distance and the full scope of Morrison's conspiracy was revealed, Mara faced a terrible choice: flee to safety and let the criminals escape justice, or return to the burning town and risk everything to save the innocent people caught in Morrison's web of destruction. The decision, when it came, was easier than she had expected. "Marshal Crawford," she said, checking her husband's research papers and medical supplies. "I'm going back to Red Hollow. Mrs. Walsh, that's suicide. Morrison has an army of killers down there. And he has innocent people trapped with them. Children who need medical attention, families who are paying the price for Morrison's crimes." She looked at Jonas, seeing the pain and guilt in his eyes. "Some debts can only be paid with action, not words." "I'm coming with you," Jonas said, struggling to his feet despite his wounds. "Why? So you can get yourself killed and call it redemption? So I can finally do something right." He met her eyes steadily. "I can't bring back your husband, Mara. But maybe I can help save the people he died trying to protect." It wasn't forgiveness. She wasn't sure she could ever forgive the man who had caused Sam's death. But it was a recognition that sometimes survival required unlikely alliances, that the fight for justice demanded every available ally, regardless of their past sins. As they prepared for the desperate ride back to Red Hollow, Mara understood that the real battle was just beginning. Morrison's conspiracy was finally exposed, but the man himself remained free, and he had proven willing to commit mass murder to protect his empire. The midpoint twist had revealed the true scope of their enemy's power and ruthlessness. Now it was time to discover whether truth and justice could triumph over money and corruption, or whether Morrison's scorched earth tactics would succeed in burying his crimes beneath the ashes of an entire town. The ride back to Red Hollow was a journey through hell itself. Smoke columns twisted into the darkening sky like the fingers of dying giants, and the acrid smell of burning wood and worse things carried on the evening wind. As they crested the final ridge, the full scope of Morrison's devastation became clear. The town was dying in sections consumed by fires that had been set with military precision. The church, the stone building that had survived Indian raids and outlaw attacks, stood as a lonely sentinel amid the destruction, its walls blackened but intact. Around it, houses and businesses burned like torches in the gathering darkness. There, Mara pointed toward the church. If anyone survived, they'll be there. But reaching the church meant crossing 3 blocks of burning hell, while Morrison's killers continued their systematic elimination of witnesses. As they rode down the main street, dodging falling timbers and choking on smoke, gunfire erupted around them. "Take cover," Jonas shouted, diving from his horse as bullets whined past their heads. They found shelter behind an overturned wagon, its cargo of grain sacks providing protection from the crossfire. From their hiding place, they could see Morrison's mercenaries moving through the town with professional efficiency, not random destruction, but targeted elimination. "They're executing people," Mara realized with horror, watching as armed men dragged families from their homes. Anyone who might testify against Morrison. "We have to reach the church," Jonas said, reloading his guns with hands that shook from blood loss and exhaustion. "But they've got the street covered." "Then we don't use the street." Mara led them through a maze of back alleys and side yards, using her intimate knowledge of Red Hollow's layout to avoid the main thoroughfares where Morrison's killers waited. They moved like ghosts through the smoke and chaos, two desperate figures trying to save what remained of a dying town. The first group of survivors they found was huddled in Martha Chen's laundry, the thick stone walls providing protection from the flames, but not from the systematic hunt going on outside. 5 women and 8 children, all of them terrified beyond reason. Mrs. Walsh. Martha Chen's voice was barely a whisper. They said you were dead killed by federal marshals. I'm very much alive. Are any of you hurt? Billy Chen took a bullet in the shoulder when we ran from the house. The bleeding's bad. Mara examined the boy quickly, her experienced hands finding the wound and assessing the damage. Clean through, missed the bone. I can treat it, but we need to get everyone to the church first. The church is surrounded. One of the women protested. Morrison's men have it blocked off. Then we'll have to clear the way. Jonas checked his weapons grimly. 2 guns, maybe 20 rounds left. Against professional killers with unlimited ammunition and superior positions, it wasn't nearly enough. I'll create a distraction, he said. Draw them off so you can get the civilians to safety. That's suicide. Maybe. But it's the first useful thing I'll have done in a long time. Before Mara could protest, he was gone, slipping out into the smoke-filled street with the grim determination of a man seeking redemption through sacrifice. The sound of gunfire erupted almost immediately. Jonas's distinctive rapid-fire shooting answered by the heavier reports of military rifles. Now, Mara gathered the survivors around her. Stay low, stay together, and run for the church when I give the signal. They moved as one through the chaos, children clinging to their mother's skirts, while Martha Chen supported her wounded son. The church was only 2 blocks away, but those blocks were a gauntlet of fire and lead. A Morrison gunman appeared at the mouth of an alley, his rifle trained on the fleeing civilians. Mara threw herself between him and the children, knowing she was about to die, when a shot rang out from behind her. The mercenary spun and fell killed by a bullet that had come from the direction of Jonas's last stand. They reached the church as the bells above them began to toll, not calling people to worship, but warning the town of approaching doom. The heavy wooden doors were barred from the inside, but Ruth Hendrick's voice called out from within. Mara, child, is that really you? It's me, Ruth. Open the doors. The church was packed with survivors, maybe 40 people huddled in the pews, their faces reflecting the orange glow of the fires outside. Ruth embraced Mara tightly, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. We thought you were dead, child. The word came that federal marshals had killed you and that gunfighter up at the old mining station. Federal marshals saved us. Morrison's been running a conspiracy that reaches all the way to the territorial capital. Mara looked around at the frightened faces surrounding her. Where's Preacher Finch? Gone. Tom Patterson said bitterly, his arm in a makeshift sling. Rode out this morning with a saddlebag full of Morrison's money. Left his congregation to burn while he saved his own skin. And Sheriff Morrow, leading the killers. Patterson spat. Wearing Morrison's badge openly now, not bothering to hide whose side he's on. The revelation that Morrow had abandoned all pretense was chilling, but not surprising. Morrison's cleanup operation had moved beyond subtlety into open warfare against anyone who might threaten his empire. How many people are still trapped in the town? Mara asked. Hard to say. Maybe 30 families scattered in hiding, afraid to come out because of the shootings. Ruth's voice was heavy with grief. The Henderson family tried to reach the church an hour ago. Morrison's men gunned them down in the street, all of them, even the children. The systematic murder of civilians was Morrison's final solution to the problem of witnesses. If he couldn't discredit them or intimidate them into silence, he would simply eliminate them entirely. We have to get these people out of here, Mara said. The church won't protect us if they decide to burn it down. Where can we go? Morrison's men control every road out of town. Before Mara could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Through the stained glass windows, they could see torches moving toward the church, Morrison's killers coming to finish their work. "Is there another way out?" Mara asked urgently. "The old tunnel," Ruth said. "Built during the Indian Wars, leads from the basement to the cemetery. But it's been sealed for years." "Show me." They descended into the church basement, a musty space filled with forgotten furniture and church records. In the far corner, behind a pile of broken pews, Ruth revealed a small opening that had been bricked up decades ago. "Help me," Mara called to the stronger men. "We need to break through." They worked frantically as the sound of shouting voices grew louder outside. The mortar was old and crumbling, and within minutes they had opened a passage large enough for people to crawl through. "Children first," Mara ordered. Then the wounded, then the women. One by one, the survivors disappeared into the narrow tunnel that led toward the cemetery and possible escape. But even as they worked, Mara knew that Morrison's reach extended far beyond Red Hollow. The mining magnate had resources and connections that could hunt them across the entire territory. The last person to enter the tunnel was Ruth Hendricks, her age, making the narrow passage difficult to navigate. "Come on, child," she urged Mara. "Your turn. Someone needs to stay behind, seal the tunnel so they can't follow." Mara looked around the basement, seeing the stacks of old papers and broken furniture that could be used to hide their escape route. "I'll catch up." "Mara, no. Go take care of them." As Ruth disappeared into the tunnel, Mara began the dangerous work of concealing their escape route. She piled debris over the opening, scattered dust and cobwebs to make it look undisturbed, and then positioned herself near the basement stairs. Above her, she could hear Morrison's killers breaking into the church, their boots echoing on the wooden floors as they searched for survivors. It was only a matter of time before they found the basement entrance. When they did, Mara would be ready for them. The second obstacle had been overcome, but at enormous cost. Jonas was probably dead. The town was destroyed. Dozens of innocent people had been murdered to protect Morrison's empire. But the survivors were safe, at least for now, and the evidence of Morrison's crimes was still intact. The final confrontation was coming, and Mara Walsh, the doctor's widow, who had once been called a witch, was about to face the most powerful and ruthless man in the territory, with nothing but her courage and her dead husband's research to sustain her. The basement door exploded inward as Morrison's killers flooded down the stairs, their rifles at the ready and murder in their eyes. Mara pressed herself against the far wall, her heart hammering as boots thundered on the wooden steps. "Nobody here," one of them called back toward the church above. "Just old junk and dust." "Check it anyway," came Sheriff Morrow's voice from the top of the stairs. "That witch is slippery as a snake. Could be hiding anywhere." The men began systematically searching the basement, overturning furniture and kicking through piles of debris. Mara held her breath, knowing that discovery meant certain death. The tunnel entrance was well hidden, but these weren't amateurs. They were professional killers who knew how to hunt human prey. That's when salvation came from an unexpected source. The sound of approaching cavalry thundered through the night air, Marshal Crawford's federal troops arriving with the authority to arrest Morrison's entire operation. The mercenaries in the basement looked at each other uncertainly. "What do we do, Sheriff?" one of them asked. "We finished the job." Morrow snarled from above. "Morrison's paying us enough to retire to Mexico. Won't matter what the federals do if there are no witnesses left to testify." But the arrival of legitimate authority had shattered the killers' unity. Some of them were professionals who killed for money. Others were local men who had been caught up in Morrison's conspiracy without fully understanding its scope. The reality of facing federal murder charges made several of them reconsider their loyalty. "I didn't sign up to fight the U.S. Army," one mercenary said, laying down his rifle. "Morrison can keep his blood money." "Coward." Morrow's voice cracked like a whip. "You'll hang for desertion. Better to hang for desertion than for murdering women and children." The dissension in Morrison's ranks gave Mara the opening she needed. She emerged from her hiding place as the killers argued among themselves, her voice cutting through their confusion like a blade. Mere Grant Morrow. Her shout echoed through the basement, freezing every man in place. I have something that belongs to you. She held up Morrison's letter, the threat that had started this entire nightmare, proof of the conspiracy that reached from the territorial capital to the ashes of Red Hollow. That's evidence of your guilt, Grant. Evidence that you murdered my husband for money, that you sold out your friends and neighbors to protect Morrison's empire. Morrow appeared at the top of the stairs, his face twisted with rage and desperate fear. The man who had once been Sam's closest friend was revealed as a hollow shell consumed by greed and corruption. You should have stayed dead, witch, he snarled, raising his gun toward her. The shot that rang out wasn't from Morrow's weapon. Jonas Vane emerged from the tunnel entrance behind the pile of debris, his face bloody and his movements painful, but his aim still deadly true. The bullet took Morrow's center mass, spinning him around and sending him tumbling down the stairs. Thought you might need help, Jonas said quietly, holstering his smoking gun. But their reunion was cut short by a new voice from the church above, cold, cultured, and absolutely without mercy. How touching, Charles Morrison said as he descended the stairs, flanked by his personal bodyguards. The whole family reunited for the finale. Morrison was everything his reputation suggested, a man of medium height and unremarkable appearance, whose true power lay in his absolute ruthlessness. He wore an expensive suit despite the chaos around him, his silver hair perfectly groomed even in the midst of mass murder. Mrs. Walsh, he continued conversationally, you've caused me considerable inconvenience. Do you have any idea how much money I've spent cleaning up your husband's meddling? Not nearly enough, Mara replied, standing straighter despite the guns trained on her. Because the truth is still going to come out. Truth is what I say it is, my dear. I own judges, senators, territorial governors. Your little collection of papers means nothing without someone alive to present them. Marshal Crawford has copies of everything. The federal investigation is already underway. Morrison's smile was genuinely amused. Marshal Crawford works for me, Mrs. Walsh. Has for years. That dramatic rescue at the mining station theater, designed to gain your trust and identify all the evidence against me. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. Crawford, the man who had seemed to represent justice and federal authority, was another of Morrison's creatures, bought and paid for like all the rest. You see, Morrison continued, I learned long ago that the best way to control the law is to become the law. Every federal marshal, every territorial judge, every railroad commissioner who matters, they all understand that Morrison Mining represents order and prosperity in this wilderness. And anyone who threatens that order dies. Anyone who threatens that order is eliminated, yes. Your husband was a particularly stubborn problem requiring more dramatic solutions than usual. But even he eventually saw reason right before Sheriff Morrow put a bullet in his brain. The casual mention of Sam's murder was meant to break her spirit, but it had the opposite effect. Mara felt her fear transforming into cold, calculating fury. The rage of a woman who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. You made one mistake, Morrison, she said quietly. What's that? You assumed I was just a grieving widow who could be frightened into submission. You never considered that I might be a healer who understands poison better than you understand people. Morrison's confident expression flickered slightly. What are you talking about? The water contamination in your mining camps. It's not just environmental pollution, is it? You've been deliberately poisoning worker communities to drive down land prices, eliminate opposition, and create health crises that justify federal intervention. That's absurd. Is it Sam's research identified specific toxins that don't occur naturally in those concentrations? Arsenic compounds, mercury derivatives, industrial chemicals that have to be deliberately introduced into water supplies. Morrison's composure was cracking as Mara continued her analysis. You're not just covering up environmental damage, you're committing genocide on a territorial scale. Thousands of people have died from your deliberate poisoning campaigns. Prove it. I don't have to. The evidence is in your own shipping records, your own chemical purchase orders, your own communications with corrupt officials. Mara smiled grimly. Sam wasn't just investigating water contamination, Morrison. He was building a case for mass murder. The magnitude of Morrison's crimes was finally laid bare. This wasn't just corporate corruption, it was systematic extermination of entire communities for profit. The mining magnate had turned environmental destruction into a weapon of genocide. None of that matters, Morrison said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Dead witnesses tell no tales, and you're about to become very dead indeed. But as his bodyguards raised their weapons, a new sound echoed through the church above the thunder of hoofbeats and shouted orders as genuine federal troops surrounded the building. Marshal Crawford might be corrupt, but there were still honest lawmen in the territorial service, and they had finally arrived to restore justice to Red Hollow. Charles Morrison. The voice from outside carried ultimate authority. This is General Marcus Stone, Territorial Military Commander. You're surrounded by federal troops and charged with treason against the United States government. Surrender immediately. Morrison's empire was finally crumbling around him. His mercenaries were deserting, his corrupted officials were fleeing, and the full weight of federal justice was descending on his conspiracy. But cornered men were dangerous, especially when they had spent decades believing themselves above the law. If I'm going down, Morrison snarled, I'm taking you with me. He raised his gun toward Mara, his finger tightening on the trigger in a final act of vindictive murder. The shot that ended Charles Morrison's reign of terror came not from his weapon, but from an unexpected source. Billy Hoffman, the young man who had burned Mara's garden and called her a witch, emerged from the tunnel entrance with a rifle in his hands and justice in his eyes. That's for my mother, he said quietly as Morrison fell. And for all the children you poisoned. In the sudden silence that followed, Mara realized that the nightmare was finally over. Morrison was dead, his conspiracy exposed, and the survivors of Red Hollow were free to rebuild their lives without fear of retribution. But the cost had been enormous. An entire town destroyed, dozens of innocent people murdered, and a way of life that could never be recovered. The climax had brought justice, but it was justice purchased with blood and paid for with grief. As federal troops secured the area and arrested Morrison's surviving mercenaries, Mara found herself standing amid the wreckage of her former life, holding the evidence that would finally vindicate her husband's memory and expose the full scope of territorial corruption. The witch hunt was over, but the healing would take much longer to complete. The trials began 6 weeks later in the territorial capital, with reporters from as far away as Chicago and San Francisco crowding the courthouse to witness the exposure of what newspapers called the Morrison conspiracy. For 3 weeks, witness after witness took the stand to detail the systematic corruption that had poisoned the American frontier. Mara testified on the 4th day, her voice steady as she presented Sam's research and documented Morrison's crimes with scientific precision. The courtroom was packed with survivors from Red Hollow and dozens of other communities that had suffered under Morrison's environmental terrorism. Dr. Walsh discovered that Morrison Mining was not merely negligent in their waste disposal. She told the rapt audience. They were deliberately poisoning water supplies to create health crises that would justify federal intervention and drive down land prices. What we witnessed in Red Hollow was not an isolated incident, but part of a territory-wide campaign of genocide for profit. The evidence was overwhelming. Morrison's own records recovered from his private office detailed decades of deliberate environmental crimes. Chemical purchase orders for toxins that had no legitimate mining application. Shipping manifests showing the transport of deadly compounds to water sources serving civilian populations. communications with corrupt officials planning the systematic elimination of entire communities. Jonas testified about his recruitment by Morrison's agents, his unwitting role in Dr. Walsh's murder, and his subsequent efforts to expose the conspiracy. His testimony was painful, but necessary, revealing the sophisticated network of manipulation that had corrupted honest men and turned them into unwitting accomplices. "I thought I was investigating a corrupt doctor," he said quietly. "Instead, I was providing information that led to the murder of an honest man trying to save lives. That knowledge has to be my burden for the rest of my life." Billy Hoffman, and the young man who had killed Morrison in the church basement, testified about the systematic indoctrination that had turned the people of Red Hollow against their neighbors. "We were taught to fear Mrs. Walsh, to blame her for our troubles," he said. "But the real source of our sickness was the water we drank, everyday water that Morrison's company had been poisoning for years." Ruth Hendricks, despite her age and the trauma she had endured, provided crucial testimony about the corruption of local officials. Her detailed memory and careful observations had preserved evidence that might otherwise have been lost. "I saw Sheriff Morrow take money from Morrison's agents," she testified. "I saw Preacher Finch alter his sermons based on instructions from corporate representatives. I saw an entire community manipulated into turning against its most vulnerable members." The defense tried to portray Morrison as a victim of employee misconduct, a successful businessman whose subordinates had exceeded their authority in pursuit of profit. But the documentary evidence was too complete, the witness testimony too consistent to support such claims. Dr. Marcus Kemp, Red Hollow's official physician who had signed the order banning Mara from practicing medicine, broke down completely on the witness stand. "They told me she was dangerous," he sobbed. "Morrison's people showed me forged reports, fake evidence that she was spreading disease instead of curing it. They paid me to sign the prohibition order, told me it was for the public good." Even the corrupt Marshall Crawford, faced with irrefutable evidence of his complicity, agreed to testify against his former employers in exchange for a reduced sentence. "Morrison's operation was the most sophisticated criminal conspiracy I've ever encountered," he admitted. "They didn't just bribe officials, they created entire false narratives, manufactured evidence, and eliminated anyone who threatened their empire." The verdicts came after 2 days of deliberation. Morrison's death had removed the conspiracy's head, but its tentacles reached throughout the territorial government. 12 officials received prison sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. Sheriff Morrow, had he lived, would have faced execution for multiple murders. But for Mara, the most important outcome was not the criminal convictions, it was the formal exoneration issued by the Territorial Health Commission, clearing her name and acknowledging her husband's heroism in exposing Morrison's crimes. Dr. Samuel Walsh died defending the health and safety of territorial citizens. The official statement read, "His widow, Mara Walsh, has been completely vindicated of all accusations made against her. We call upon all citizens to remember that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would corrupt justice for personal gain." The monetary settlements that followed provided resources for rebuilding Red Hollow and compensating the victims of Morrison's environmental crimes. The mining company's seized assets were liquidated to fund medical treatment for poisoning victims and environmental restoration of contaminated areas. But money could not restore the lives lost or heal the psychological wounds inflicted by years of systematic persecution. The witch hunt had ended, but its scars would remain for generations. As the legal proceedings concluded and the reporters packed up their notebooks, Mara found herself facing the same question that had haunted her since the nightmare began. What to do with the rest of her life? 1 year later, Mara Walsh stood in the rebuilt center of Red Hollow, watching as the new schoolhouse was dedicated with speeches and celebration. The town had risen from its ashes, like a phoenix transformed by tragedy into something stronger and more resilient than before. The new Red Hollow was different from the old wider streets designed for better fire protection a modern water system engineered by federal specialists to prevent contamination, and most importantly, a community educated about the dangers of fear and superstition. Dr. Walsh. Mayor Tom Patterson approached her with a formal invitation in his hand. The Territorial Medical Board wants to offer you the position of Chief Health Officer for the entire Kansas Territory. It's a chance to prevent what happened here from happening anywhere else. The offer was generous and well-deserved. Mara's expertise in environmental health and her experience with corporate corruption made her uniquely qualified to protect other communities from Morrison's kind of predatory capitalism. "I'm honored," she replied. "But I have commitments here that I can't abandon." She gestured toward the medical clinic she had established in Red Hollow, not just a place for treating the sick, but a training center where local women learned the arts of healing and midwifery. Her students came from across the territory, drawn by her reputation and her commitment to medical knowledge as a tool of community empowerment. Ruth Hendricks, now her assistant and partner in the clinic, approached with her characteristic blend of warmth and practicality. "Child, you can't save the whole territory by staying in one small town. There are other places that need what you've learned here. And there are people here who still need me. The poisoning victims who require ongoing treatment and the children born with health problems from their mother's exposure to Morrison's toxins." It was true. The environmental crimes of the Morrison era had created medical challenges that would persist for decades. Mara's clinic treated not just acute illnesses, but the long-term consequences of systematic poisoning, birth defects, developmental disorders, chronic diseases that would affect families for generations. Jonas appeared at her side, walking with the slight limp that was his permanent souvenir of their confrontation with Morrison's killers. He had stayed in Red Hollow after the trials, using his share of the settlement money to fund the town's reconstruction and establish a school for teaching literacy and critical thinking. "The territorial offer is a good one," he said quietly. "You could do a lot of good in that position. What about you? The Pinkerton Agency wants to hire you as a federal investigator. It's a chance to hunt down other conspiracies like Morrison's. I've done enough hunting for one lifetime. These days, I prefer building things to tearing them down." Their relationship had evolved into something complex and difficult to define, not quite friendship, not quite forgiveness, but a partnership built on shared trauma and mutual respect. Jonas would never be fully redeemed for his role in Sam's death, but he had spent the past year trying to honor the memory of the man he had betrayed. The ceremony continued around them, but Mara found her attention drawn to the cemetery on the hill above town. 2 new graves had been added since the trials, fresh markers for Tommy Walsh and Dr. Samuel Walsh, relocated from their original burial sites to a place of honor overlooking the community they had died protecting. "I need to visit them," she said quietly. "Want company?" "Please." They walked together up the hill, past the original graves of Red Hollow's founders and the newer markers commemorating victims of Morrison's conspiracy. At the top of the hill, beneath a spreading oak tree that had somehow survived the fires, lay the graves of her husband and son. Someone had been tending the plots in her absence, keeping the weeds cleared and the markers clean. Fresh wildflowers decorated both graves, bright marigolds that bloomed defiantly in the harsh Kansas soil. "Hattie Morrison's been coming up here," Jonas said quietly. "Her and several other mothers whose children you saved. They wanted to make sure your family wasn't forgotten." The gesture brought tears to Mara's eyes. After everything that had happened, the fear, the persecution, the systematic campaign to destroy her, there were still people who remembered her as a healer rather than a witch. "I think Sam would be proud," she said, kneeling to arrange the flowers more carefully. "He always said that healing was about community, not individual heroism." "What would he think about the territorial appointment?" "He'd probably tell me to take it." Sam was always thinking about the bigger picture, about how to help the most people possible. "But you're not going to." "No, I'm not." She stood brushing dirt from her hands. Red Hollow is where I belong, where I can do the most good by staying rather than leaving. As they walked back down the hill toward the town celebration, Mara felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for more than a year. The nightmare was truly over. Morrison was dead, his conspiracy exposed, and the community that had once called her a witch now honored her as a healer. But the most important transformation was internal. The broken woman who had buried her child alone had been forged by fire into something stronger, not just a survivor, but a protector of others who faced similar persecution. The final surprise came as they reached the edge of the celebration. A young woman approached hesitantly, her face showing the telltale signs of Morrison's environmental poisoning, the pale complexion and chronic fatigue that marked so many of the conspiracy's victims. "Mrs. Walsh, I'm Mary Chen from the mining camps up north. I've traveled 3 days to see you." "What's wrong, child?" "It's my daughter. She's been sick since birth, and the doctors in the territorial capital say there's nothing they can do. But I heard you might understand her condition better than most." Mara looked at the young mother, seeing in her face the same desperation that had driven so many others to seek healing from the woman they once called a witch. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would. "Bring her to the clinic tomorrow," Mara said gently. "We'll see what we can do." As the woman walked away with hope in her eyes, Mara understood that her decision to stay in Red Hollow was the right one. There would always be new victims of old crimes, new children who needed healing, new mothers seeking hope in the face of impossible circumstances. "You see," Jonas said quietly, "this is where you're needed most. Not in some territorial office pushing papers, but here doing what you've always done, healing people one at a time." The celebration continued around them as the sun began to set over the rebuilt town. Children played in streets that had once been battlegrounds, their laughter echoing off buildings that had risen from ashes and memory. Red Hollow had been transformed by its ordeal, not just physically rebuilt, but spiritually renewed. As darkness fell and the townspeople began lighting lanterns for the evening festivities, Mara noticed something that filled her heart with quiet joy. On Tommy's grave, barely visible in the gathering twilight, new marigolds had sprouted wild flowers that had seeded themselves, growing without cultivation or care. Like hope itself, they bloomed where they were planted, bright and stubborn and impossible to destroy. "Thank you, Sam," she whispered to the evening air, "for showing me that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost." Jonas stood beside her in comfortable silence, two broken people who had found a way to build something meaningful from the wreckage of their past. They would never be free of their sins, his betrayal, her survivor's guilt, but they had learned that redemption came not from forgetting the past, but from using its lessons to build a better future. As the stars appeared in the Kansas sky and the celebration moved indoors, Mara Walsh, no longer the town witch, but Red Hollow's guardian angel, walked home to prepare for another day of healing in a world that would always need healers. The story was finished, but the work of healing would continue for as long as there were broken people seeking wholeness, sick children needing medicine, and communities learning to choose hope over fear. In Red Hollow, where marigolds bloomed wild in the cemetery, and a former witch had become the town's most beloved citizen, that work would never end. And Mara Walsh wouldn't have it any other way.